Beneath the icy snow that blankets Cleveland, a tiny grave silently tells a horrifying story. A 5-year-old deaf and mute boy abandoned and brutally abused within the walls of his own home. Behind a mother's fake smiles hid years of unspeakable torment ignored by everyone who should have cared. The Jordan Rodriguez case is not just a tale of human cruelty. It's an indictment of an entire society's indifference. What truly happened? Who is truly to blame? And how could an innocent child be buried unnoticed by the world? Join us as we uncover the chilling truth behind this heartbreaking story. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on powerful true crime cases and enjoy special upcoming offers. On a freezing December morning, icy winds howled through the empty streets of Cleveland, Ohio. Snow-blanketed rooftops covering the worn cracks of old walls. Inside a small police station, a telephone rang out, cutting through the heavy, somber air. On the other end, a man's voice trembled with fear and desperation. He identified himself as Scott Rodriguez, calling all the way from Pakistan. His words were broken heavy with emotion. But one thing was clear. "I have a feeling the child is dead. It's my nephew." The sentence struck like a blade of ice straight to the heart. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the distant howling of the winter wind. Officers exchanged worried glances, each one sensing the shadow of something terrible looming just beyond the horizon. No one in that room could have predicted that this call would pull them into one of the darkest cases of their careers, a tragedy so cruel it would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. Scott Rodriguez was not a man who panicked easily, but tonight across half the world he couldn't sleep. He couldn't ignore the gnawing horror gnashing at his mind, a horror heavier than the snowstorms burying Cleveland under endless white. The officers immediately pulled up the address Scott provided, a small house tucked into a struggling neighborhood on Cleveland's west side. According to him, it belonged to his sister Larissa Rodriguez, who lived there with multiple children, including a boy with special needs. Jordan Rodriguez. Questions began piling up. Why would a man thousands of miles away be so certain something was wrong? What had he heard? Why, out of all the homes in this frozen city, did his instincts scream out for this one? Outside, the sky sagged under a heavy ash-gray ceiling. Snow continued to fall in thick, blinding sheets, burying sidewalks and smothering footprints before they could even settle. The streets stood eerily silent, the lamplight casting a dull glow on frozen puddles of slush. The air was dense, suffocating like the breath of a monster waiting just beneath the surface. Detectives were dispatched immediately. Tires spun against the thick ice as patrol cars pulled away from the station, their sirens wailing into the deaf, cold morning. A heavy sense of dread filled the air, an unspoken warning that even Cleveland itself seemed to hold its breath. None of them knew yet that they were driving straight into a nightmare that began with a simple phone call, but would end with a horror none of them would ever forget. The knocking echoed through the bitter, cold air. 3 officers stood before a crumbling house, swallowed by a neighborhood long abandoned by hope. Here, poverty and neglect had eaten away at every brick, every rotting window frame. Snow weighed heavily on the sagging roof, like the dust of forgotten years smothering all signs of life. The door creaked open with a chilling groan. Standing before them was Lissa Rodriguez, her hair greasy, her face pale and hollow. Dark circles etched deep beneath her eyes, yet she smiled a forced, uneasy smile that didn't reach the deadness in her gaze. "Nothing's wrong, officers," she said lightly. "The kids are fine. Please come in." A wave of rancid air hit them the moment the door swung wider, the stench of mold decay and something darker, something foul that clung to the walls and floors. Inside, shadows ruled. Weak beams of light struggled through the grime-covered windows. Along the hallway, bits of rotting food, soiled clothing, and fat, sluggish insects told a silent story of long-standing rot and ruin. One officer swept his gaze carefully across the scene. In the dim corner at the end of the hall, a pair of tiny eyes peeked out from behind a cracked door, wide, wet, and filled with terror, the kind of terror that could not be spoken aloud, only screamed through a look that pierced straight into the soul. The officers exchanged a brief, knowing glance. Without a word, they stepped deeper inside their heavy boots, squelching into the damp, sticky floor. Every step echoed too loudly, as if threatening to wake something monstrous that slept between the broken walls. Lissa kept smiling, tugging nervously at her threadbare sweater. She spoke rapidly, almost desperately, repeating over and over that the kids were fine, that they were just sleeping, that there was nothing to worry about. But every word she spoke fell flat, like stones dropped into a dry, empty well. Another child flitted behind her filthy gaunt, barely more than a shadow, and then disappeared into the gloom. The officer's instincts sharpened. This house wasn't right. Nothing here was right. Somewhere in this house the truth was hiding. It was bleeding quietly through the floorboards, seeping from the peeling walls. It wasn't just the filth. It wasn't just the stink. It was the unbearable silence, the heavy, suffocating kind that wrapped around them like a shroud. Something terrible had happened here, something that even the snowfall outside couldn't cover. And this was only the beginning. Inside that rotting house, the truth slowly began to take shape, a twisted, horrifying portrait of what Lissa Rodriguez called family. She had 9 children each, by a different father. Fleeting relationships, forgotten names, and children abandoned like worn-out possessions no one bothered to keep. The 3 eldest had long been sent away to live with grandparents or estranged fathers. The younger ones were left scattered throughout this decaying home, trapped in chaos that no one could fix. Lissa rattled off their names with mechanical indifference, as if reciting items on a grocery list. To her, the arrival or loss of a child seemed as weightless as changing clothes. There was no love here, no protection. As the investigation dug deeper, testimonies from neighbors began painting an even bleaker picture. One elderly woman living across the street recalled with a broken voice, "One night, almost midnight, I looked out my window and saw a little one, maybe 3, maybe 4 years old, wandering the sidewalk. Just a diaper on, no shoes, no coat, just bare feet pressing into frozen concrete, shivering so hard it looked like he might disappear." She had called Child Protective Services. But like so many cries for help in this neighborhood, it disappeared into the system's endless void. Another tragedy swallowed whole by a city too numb, too overwhelmed to care anymore. The neighborhood itself was a breeding ground for heartbreak. Cleveland West 80th Street, a stretch of forgotten America where violent crime rates soared far beyond national averages. Stabbings, domestic assaults, drug abuse all festered like open wounds beneath the crumbling surface of daily life. Here everyone knew everyone else's pain, but no one spoke, no one intervened. Fear was the language of survival, so was hopelessness, and the authorities, overwhelmed, underfunded, burned out, had long since stopped believing they could make a difference. In this frozen wasteland of a community, Lissa's children existed like small, invisible ghosts, adrift in a silent storm with no shelter, no hands to hold them. Each day they survived was not a gift, but a quiet, aching miracle. They had learned early that silence was safer than screams. They knew that crying would save no one. They knew that in this world it was better to disappear than to hope. And on that snow-choked night, as officers stood inside Lissa's filthy home, breathing in the stench of rot and lies, they had no idea they were standing at the mouth of a chasm darker and deeper than anything they had ever encountered, a chasm that would soon reveal its full monstrous depth and threaten to pull them all under. Inside that suffocating, crumbling house, as the officers' heavy steps echoed through the cold, hollow rooms, a single name began to surface: Jordan Rodriguez. At just 5 years old, Jordan was unlike any other child they had ever encountered. According to the thin file dug up from local child services, Jordan was born deaf and mute, mentally delayed, and had never once set foot inside a preschool. A child trapped in darkness, both physically and emotionally, utterly cut off from the world beyond these rotting walls. When asked about Jordan, Lissa Rodriguez replied quickly, her voice coated in brittle confidence. "He's in Texas, visiting his dad." The words slipped out as casually as a breath of air. But underneath her calm exterior, the detectives caught the first cracks beginning to show. No paperwork, no emails, no phone records. No one had seen Jordan leave this house. Neighbors. Those same neighbors who often spotted Lissa's children wandering aimlessly swore they hadn't seen Jordan for months. Lissa's story, no matter how smoothly she recited it, was nothing more than a paper-thin curtain hiding a bottomless pit behind it. Outside, the wind knifed through the broken seams of the house, carrying with it the stench of death into every corner. The sky hung heavy and gray, a massive funeral shroud draped across the city. Snow clung stubbornly to the roofs, thick and unmoving, pressing down on rotting beams, just as the unbearable weight of hidden horrors pressed down on this home. Lissa's indifference mirrored the merciless cold outside, cold enough to slice to the bone, cold enough to crush whatever life still flickered inside. When the detectives pressed for more details, she simply shrugged, claiming she had lost contact with the father in Texas. No address, no number, no names, no proof. No reason to believe her. Only a dreadful emptiness where answers should have been. One of the officers, a veteran of child abuse cases, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He knew these signs too well. He knew that when a child disappeared without a trace, without anyone to vouch for them, it almost always ended in tragedy. Outside, the wind howled like a mourning spirit lost in the endless winter. Inside, the detectives stood still, feeling the darkness pressing closer, breathing it in with every shallow breath. Jordan was not here. And somewhere out there, a fragile, silent life had been snuffed out, swallowed whole by the cruelty festering within these walls. They didn't have the answers yet, but in that moment they knew they had to find the truth, no matter what it cost. The official investigation had begun tearing open a door to the darkness, letting fragments of buried pain rise from the shadows. As the officers dug through the files, a brutal truth emerged. Countless social workers had once visited this very house. Welfare checks, neighbor complaints, documented warnings, all of it was there. Yet somehow Lissa Rodriguez had always found a way to fool them. Each time an inspector came, she would hastily clean up, shove the kids into a back room, spin whatever lies she needed, and somehow the very people tasked with protecting Jordan and his siblings would leave believing or pretending to believe that everything was under control. That negligence piled up over the years like layers of dust. Nobody bothered to wipe away until it hardened into an inevitable tragedy waiting to explode. And then among the cold statements and old reports, a new witness surfaced, an ordinary man outside the system, the local mailman. For 3 long years he had delivered letters to this block, a silent observer, to things no one wanted to confront. Sitting under the flickering yellow lights of the police station, his rough hands clenched tightly together, he began to speak. His voice was low, cracked. "I heard it," he said. "Heard what?" an officer asked. "The crying off and on for months from that house, like a child's cry too weak to even be loud, but—" He faltered, his eyes reddening. "No one ever said a thing, not even me." He explained that in this neighborhood, shouting, fighting, and screaming were common sounds, part of the background noise of survival. People learned to tune it out like traffic or distant sirens, but the crying from that house was different. It gnawed at him. It was quieter, sadder, filled with a hopelessness he couldn't forget. He described standing on the frozen sidewalk, once mail still clutched in his hands, listening to that faint, broken sobbing. But then, like everyone else, he turned away. Fear, helplessness, habit. Here, in this forgotten corner of Cleveland, pretending not to hear had become second nature. Now sitting before the detectives, the old man's voice trembled with regret. "If I had done something sooner, maybe that little boy would still be alive." Outside, the winter wind howled through the deserted streets, a ghostly chorus of accusations piercing through the bricks and bones of a city that had failed its weakest children. Inside, the resolve among the detectives hardened. They knew this case wasn't simple. It wasn't just about a monstrous mother or a cruel boyfriend. It was a damning indictment of an entire system, a system that had let Jordan's desperate cries vanish into nothingness. And this time they swore those cries would not be forgotten. In the early days of the investigation, detectives traced every frayed thread of Larissa Rodriguez's past. And from the shadows, another figure slowly emerged: Christopher Rodriguez. They met through a simple dating app, a few rushed messages, a handful of hasty calls. Then within a month, Christopher had packed his belongings along with all his dark secrets and moved straight into the crumbling house on West 80th Street. No lease, no verification. Just a desperate woman flinging her door wide open to anyone who could offer her even a flicker of warmth. Christopher brought nothing but a trail of damage behind him, unpaid child support, a history of violence left unresolved, but in Lissa's world, he seemed almost like a savior, or at least someone who could stand between her and the crushing loneliness. From that moment, the house ceased to be just a place of decay. It became a nest of violence, lies, and neglect. But someone had seen the signs. Local healthcare workers, those tasked with routine community welfare checks, had sounded alarms. They filed reports warning that Lissa Rodriguez's home showed severe signs of child abuse. Bruises of unknown origin on the children's bodies, severe signs of malnutrition, fearful withdrawn behavior whenever outsiders appeared. One health worker even submitted a petition calling for an immediate, deeper investigation. In that petition, she wrote, "If we don't act soon, one of these children will never walk out of that house alive." But once again, the system failed. That petition, along with countless others, vanished into the mountains of neglected paperwork, buried in rusted filing cabinets, inside an overwhelmed, indifferent government office. While statistics about caseloads grew fatter, while budget meetings and staffing debates dragged on in that crumbling house, Lissa's children, including little Jordan, fought daily battles against hunger, cold, and brutal violence. Christopher, who should have been an adult protector, became instead a silent accomplice. He lived there, he saw, he heard, he knew. And still he turned away, or worse, he participated. And at the center of it all was Larissa Rodriguez, the woman who should have been their shield. She smiled sweetly whenever someone asked about the kids. She played the part of the devoted mother. Well, but the moldy walls, the freezing winds slipping through broken windows, and the tear-streaked faces of her children told a much crueler truth. As the detectives pieced together these fragments, a savage picture came into focus, not just of one guilty woman, but of an entire rotten machine, a society where children like Jordan became nothing more than cold statistics on forgotten sheets of paper. And within that broken world, the seeds of tragedy had been allowed to quietly grow until it was far, far too late. Inside the cold, cramped interrogation room under the flickering hum of a fluorescent light, Larissa Rodriguez sat facing the piercing eyes of the detectives. From the very first minute, her evasiveness was unmistakable. When asked about Jordan, Lissa answered with chilling indifference, "He's in Texas visiting his dad." But only minutes later, when pressed casually about the father's name, she faltered, her eyes darting wildly. Suddenly, the story shifted. He moved away. I'm not sure anymore. Maybe Jordan's with his grandmother." Each answer was a different version, a new fragment broken off from the last. Names, places, reasons. They changed, constantly slipping through her fingers like sand. Lissa's story was unraveling in real time, a tapestry of lies she could no longer weave together. The detectives, seasoned veterans at sniffing out deceit, didn't rush. They didn't interrupt. They simply watched and waited. With every passing second, the panic in Lissa grew more visible. Each time she realized she'd tripped over her own words, her eyes flicked desperately around the room as if searching for an invisible escape. Each nervous tug at her sleeve, each wringing of her trembling hands, screamed a truth louder than any confession. She was scared she was losing control. Her hands, which had only trembled slightly at first, now visibly shook whenever the detectives zeroed in on a detail. When one officer casually asked about the last time Jordan had been seen at school or a doctor's office, Lissa gave a tight, hollow laugh, twisting her fingers together until they turned white and mumbled, I'm not sure. Maybe a few months ago? Maybe longer? The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the steady, merciless ticking of the wall clock each second, marking another crack in her crumbling facade. In the corner of the room, a folded report from local healthcare workers sat silently listing old injuries on Jordan's body, signs of prolonged starvation, unexplained absences from any institution that should have safeguarded him. The detectives knew without speaking. Every minute that passed, Lissa's mask was slipping deeper into ruin. They didn't need to yell, they didn't need to threaten, they simply let her own fear dismantle her. Outside, snow continued to fall in heavy, suffocating sheets, blanketing the rooftops in endless gray. The wind howled through the darkened alleys, colder, but somehow still more merciful than the chill wrapping itself around the woman sitting before them. Jordan, the silent boy, was still missing. But the truth buried under layers of frantic lies was starting to seep through like groundwater, slow but unstoppable, breaking down even the thickest of walls. The detectives didn't say it out loud. They didn't need to. They knew. They had touched Lissa's deepest fear. The fear of exposure. The fear of losing control. The fear that this time no one would believe her tired, hollow excuses. And in the desperate trembling of her hands, a piece of the terrible truth was beginning to emerge. That night, Cleveland was buried under a brutal, freezing cold. Winds howled through the cracks of abandoned homes, carrying the sharp breath of a merciless winter. Under the weak glow of flashlights and distant street lamps, police officers began digging through the frozen backyard of Larissa Rodriguez's home. The ground was hard as stone, frozen solid. Every strike of the shovel echoed with a hollow, jarring thud. Even the most seasoned officers, men and women hardened by years of facing death, felt a shiver crawl down their spines as chunks of dark, frozen earth were torn loose. 3 long hours dragged by. Their fingers went numb under thick gloves, their backs stiffened against the relentless cold. Mud clung to their boots, their coats, their faces, but no one stopped to wipe it away. No one spoke. Only the grunts of effort and the brutal rhythm of digging filled the night. And then a soft call broke the silence. The blade of a shovel struck something, not earth, not rock, something soft, something wrong. Immediately the team fell silent, kneeling down over the disturbed soil. They dug now with gloved hands, gently, carefully peeling back the frozen ground layer by layer until the blurry shape of a small body emerged. Jordan Rodriguez, the 5-year-old boy missing for months now, lay still, wrapped in a thin, rotting blanket, hastily stuffed inside layers of black trash bags. His tiny body showed signs of severe decomposition, silent testimony to abandonment, to neglect, to a lonely death no one had heard. No one said a word, no one cursed, no one cried. The weight of grief was too heavy, pressing down on every chest, choking the air from their lungs. At that exact moment, the snow began to fall. Tiny flakes, cold and quiet, drifted downward, blanketing the muddy grave, the fragile, broken body of Jordan, and the devastated faces of the men and women who had unearthed him. Time seemed to freeze. The world held its breath. Here lay a child forgotten in life, and now quietly swallowed by the winter in death. The wind swept across the open pit, carrying with it the unspoken sobs trapped in throats too tight with sorrow to speak. In that moment, it wasn't about procedure anymore. It wasn't about the job. It was about a brutal, unflinching truth. They had come too late. Jordan, the silent boy who had suffered unseen, had left this world in the same way he lived, unheard, unprotected, alone. And that night in Cleveland, it wasn't just snow that fell. It was guilt. It was regret. It was silent verdicts falling heavy over everyone who had failed him, never to be melted away. The news of Jordan's body being found spread across the frozen neighborhood like a bitter wind. Family members, the surviving children, one by one, were pulled back into memories they had tried so hard to bury. But this time, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, the pain poured out raw and unstoppable. Lissa's younger sister. Her eyes swollen and voice trembling broke down as she spoke of Jordan. I saw him. She choked, struggling for air before she could continue. I saw Jordan forced to gag on a filthy sock locked in a dark closet. No light, no sound, just these little whimpers so faint you had to strain your ears to even notice. She described nights when Jordan was forced to kneel for hours in the dark, his hands tied behind his back with rough rope. Because he was deaf and mute, he couldn't scream, only let out these thin, strangled sounds, barely louder than the wind slipping through cracked windows. But in that house, no one heard him, and if they did, they pretended not to. The surviving children sat silent, their eyes hollow as they recounted what they had witnessed. They spoke of terrifying nights when Jordan was beaten until he collapsed. The fists, the kicks, the belts, they fell on that small, fragile body over and over, day after day. One child, barely whispering, said, "One time I saw blood coming out of Jordan's mouth, but Mom said it was just him playing too rough. She told us not to tell anyone. If we did, we'd be locked up just like Jordan." Silence wasn't a choice, it was a sentence, a punishment, a cage that trapped their childhoods, crushed them day by day. Outside, the snow kept falling, swallowing the Cleveland skyline in an endless, blinding white. But inside that small room, the stories that poured out were sharper, colder, and far more devastating than any winter storm. No one asked follow-up questions, no one hurried them. They let the children dig through their memories at their own broken pace, unearthing shards of a truth too terrible to rush. Each story fell into the air like shattered glass, catching the sterile light and cutting deep into everyone who dared to listen. Even the toughest investigators, those hardened by years of horror, had to turn their faces away, hiding the red rims of their eyes. Jordan hadn't just died of hunger or cold. He died slowly, piece by piece, crushed by isolation, cruelty, and absolute abandonment by those who were supposed to protect him. And now the memories of his suffering, sharp as knives, rose from the past and stabbed straight into the hearts of the living. The next morning, as snow continued to fall heavily over the rooftops of Cleveland, forensic examiners began the grim task of examining Jordan Rodriguez's tiny body, and layer by layer a horrifying truth emerged, colder and more merciless than any winter storm. Under the sterile fluorescent lights of the autopsy room, Jordan's fragile frame told a story louder than any scream. He bore multiple broken bones, fractures in his arms, ribs, and even his ankle. But these were not fresh injuries. They had healed on their own, crooked and deformed. It could mean only one thing. Jordan had endured prolonged pain, untreated, uncared for, and worst of all, unnoticed. Each crack, each twisted bone was an undeniable accusation, proof that this little boy had suffered brutal abuse over an extended period of time, suffering silently in that rotting house without a single voice raised on his behalf. The forensic doctors, hardened by years of facing death and violence, stood silent for a long moment over the table where Jordan lay. Outside the morgue, the detectives continued combing through the battered streets of the neighborhood, a place too familiar with screams, thuds, and the deadly silence that followed. It was during these rounds that they found a new witness, a woman who lived near Lissa's house, a silent witness for far too long. Sitting hunched in an old threadbare coat, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of cold coffee, the woman spoke in a hoarse whisper. "I heard it. I saw it so many times. The boy, he was always being yelled at, cursed at. At first I thought it was just rough parenting, but then I started hearing these little whimpers at night." She had picked up the phone countless times, ready to call the police, but each time she put it down, fear paralyzed her. "Around here," she said, her voice breaking, "if you call the cops and they find out they come for you, they smash your windows, they threaten your kids. I have a family. I have little ones." Tears streamed down her face as she choked out, "I was scared, I turned away." The weight of guilt pressed down on her shoulders like 1,000 tons. Every second she hesitated, every time she chose silence over action, carved itself into the tragedy that swallowed Jordan whole. In a city where fear ruled, where violence was seen as part of life, cries like Jordan's were smothered before they could ever be heard. No one dared listen. No one dared look. And now, under the brutal evidence laid bare by the autopsy table and the bitter regrets of a once silent neighbor, one truth stood clear. Jordan Rodriguez didn't die by accident. He died because an entire community turned away, because fear triumphed, because indifference became the norm, because courage never came in time. Inside the interrogation room, the air grew thick as if even breathing had become a burden. Larissa Rodriguez slumped in her metal chair, her hands twisted tightly together, her eyes darting around, desperate for an escape that didn't exist. The questioning began. And like so many before her, Lissa did the predictable thing. She blamed someone else. She quickly pointed a trembling finger at Christopher Rodriguez, spinning a story with a voice that cracked in all the right places. I was a victim too. He hit me. He forced me to do it. I didn't have a choice. Lissa painted herself as a battered woman, trapped by fear, coerced into silence, a helpless mother, crushed by an abusive man. She cried. She shook. She tried to wrap herself in the tattered robes of victimhood, but this time no one believed her. The detectives, armed with a heavy stack of evidence, pushed back hard. They brought out neighbor testimonies, people who had heard Lissa's vicious screams aimed directly at Jordan, echoing through the paper-thin walls. They read statements from former friends, witnesses who had visited the house and seen Lissa beating Jordan for minor infractions like spilling a glass of water or simply not obeying fast enough. One witness even described seeing Jordan forced to kneel in the backyard in freezing temperatures, dressed only in a thin t-shirt as punishment for some trivial mistake. Each piece of evidence, each eyewitness account was another hammer blow against the shaky wall of lies Lissa tried to hide behind. And brick by brick, her carefully constructed story crumbled into dust. It wasn't just words. There were old text messages, blurry cell phone photos snapped by concerned visitors, even short, shaky recordings of arguments. All of it pointing to one undeniable truth. Larissa Rodriguez wasn't a victim. She was the architect of Jordan's terror. Yes, Christopher bore guilt too, but it was Lissa who had inflicted the most pain. It was Lissa who had created a home soaked in fear. It was Lissa who had let Jordan wither away under her roof day after day with cruel indifference. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, Lissa's panic became impossible to hide. Her hands gripped the edges of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned ghostly white. The tears falling down her cheeks were no longer cries of remorse. They were tears of fear. Fear that the truth had finally caught up to her. Fear that justice was no longer something she could outrun. Outside the interrogation room's frosted window, snow began to fall again. Silent, relentless. Just like the truth falling in cold, heavy sheets over every last lie she had told. The final days of Jordan Rodriguez's life weren't marked by laughter, warm embraces, or the simple joys every child deserves. They were etched with loneliness, cold, and a suffocating terror that clung to every shallow breath he took. Inside that decaying house where light was choked by filthy curtains and bolted doors, Jordan often sat curled up alone in the corner of a dark, frozen room. A threadbare blanket barely covered his trembling, bony frame. His small body was covered in bruises, fingerprints pressed into tender skin, swollen welts layered over half-healed wounds, and his eyes, wide, dark, haunting, radiated a silent terror so deep it could paralyze anyone who dared to meet his gaze. He didn't cry out for help, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Born deaf and mute, Jordan lived locked inside a private prison, a world where pain had no sound and fear had no voice. All he could do was shrink smaller, curl tighter, desperately trying to make himself invisible, hoping that if he became small enough, still enough, maybe the monsters would pass him by. Later buried among the neglected reports and forgotten warnings, a pediatrician who had once examined Jordan gave a heartbreaking testimony. The doctor remembered vividly the hollow, haunted look in Jordan's eyes and how the boy flinched violently at even the gentlest touch. Jordan displayed every sign of severe PTSD. The doctor said, his voice heavy with guilt. The terror in his eyes, the involuntary flinching the way he recoiled into himself. This was not normal behavior for a child. We recommended urgent psychological intervention several times, but no one ever brought him back. No one took him for help. Those recommendations, like so many other cries for intervention in Jordan's short life, were simply ignored, lost in the endless void of bureaucracy and indifference. Jordan wasn't just abandoned physically, he was emotionally exiled, trapped inside a silent nightmare, unseen, unrescued, unheard. And during those final days, as winter's grip tightened around Cleveland, Jordan simply began to fade. No one to call for, no dreams left to cling to. Just shallow breaths growing fainter, slipping away into the frozen dark. When they finally found his body, it was a fragile, wasted shell, marked by months of pain, hunger, and the kind of despair no child should ever know. A life not just lost, but buried under layers of neglect, cruelty, and the brutal indifference of a world that had long since stopped listening. In the spring of the following year, inside a Cleveland courtroom heavy with sorrow, justice finally arrived, late but undeniable. Larissa Rodriguez stood before the bench, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit, her face hollow, her eyes emptied of even the last drops of false tears. Beside her, Christopher Rodriguez sat slumped, shackled, and silent, a defeated shadow of a man. Before the judge and the grieving families, the charges were read aloud, each word cutting through the thick, oppressive air. The undeniable evidence. The old and new injuries found on Jordan's broken body, the heart-wrenching testimonies of witnesses, the countless failures of the child protection system, all laid bare a tapestry woven from years of pain and systemic neglect. As the prosecutor pieced together the timeline of Jordan's buried life, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. No one could look away from the horror that had been hidden for so long. When it came time to deliver the sentences, the judge, a man who had seen countless horrors over a long career, found himself choking with emotion. Removing his glasses, he wiped away a tear and said, his voice breaking, "This is one of the most heartbreaking cases I have ever encountered in my entire career." Larissa Rodriguez was sentenced to 25 years in prison for child abuse leading to death and severe neglect. Christopher Rodriguez received 28 years charged with similar crimes compounded by his cold-hearted cruelty. No genuine apology was ever offered. No explanation could lessen the weight of what had been lost. Family members of the surviving children wept openly. Others sat silently gripping each other's hands as if letting go might shatter them completely. In that moment, the sentencing was not just about punishing two individuals. It was a bitter confession. The system had failed. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes the monsters don't hide in the shadows. They live right next door, in the very places we believe are safe. When the judge finally struck his gavel, the sound echoed like the slamming of a coffin lid, sealing shut one of the darkest chapters Cleveland had ever seen. Outside the courthouse, late-season snow fell silently, dusting the stone steps in a thin, mournful white. No one celebrated. No one felt victorious. Because no sentence, no matter how heavy, could ever bring Jordan Rodriguez back. The day the court delivered its verdict was also the day Larissa Rodriguez's family fully received the devastating news. It wasn't just shame that filled the room. It was the full weight of a tragedy that had crushed an entire generation of forgotten children. Lissa's older sister, a frail woman with hollowed cheeks and sleepless eyes, recalled that fateful moment. When the news arrived that Jordan had died buried beneath the filthy backyard of that house, the small room where the family had gathered seemed to freeze solid. "No one could speak," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We just sat there, each person in their own corner, and the children, they just clung to each other and cried." In that cold, broken room, there was no screaming, no shouting, no desperate questioning. Only the soft, fractured sobs of grief echoing endlessly in the stale air, like the cries of souls that had been crushed beyond saving. The surviving children, Jordan's brothers and sisters huddled together, small bodies shaking tear-streaked faces staring blankly into the darkened void. They were too young to understand everything, but old enough to feel the loss, a loss so deep, so cold, it seemed to seep into their very bones. Lissa's sister struggled to steady her voice as she remembered how that night the children asked the questions no adult could answer. Why didn't Mommy save Jordan? Why didn't anyone hear him? Simple questions, and yet each one cut deeper than any blade, twisting inside hearts already broken beyond repair. No one could offer answers. No one could meet the eyes of those children waiting, hoping for a promise that things would somehow be different now. A promise that on that freezing night was already too late. Outside, the wind howled through the cracked window frames, carrying icy breath into the trembling room. Inside, cold breaths, shaking embraces, silent tears, they mingled together into a quiet, aching portrait of grief. Lissa's sister said that from that moment on, their family was never the same. Jordan's death hadn't just stolen the life of a little boy. It had stolen their trust. It had stolen their innocence. It had left behind empty spaces in their homes, in their dreams, in their hearts, spaces that would never be filled again. And in the midst of all that wreckage, one question still lingered, hanging in the air like a ghost. No one could drive away. If we had listened sooner, would things have been different? Though the court had handed down heavy sentences, though Larissa Rodriguez and Christopher Rodriguez would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, there remained another sentence, one far heavier than any prison term, the sentence of conscience. No prison door could silence the screaming memories. No set of handcuffs could lock away the image of a little boy shivering in the dark, waiting for help that never came. In the dead of night, when the world is silent, when no lawyers are left to argue and no excuses remain to shield them, it is in that silence where guilt will rise and cling to their minds like a life sentence with no parole, no forgiveness. They could tell themselves 1,000 times that they too were victims. They could blame circumstances, society, anyone, but it would never change the simple, brutal truth. They chose to turn away when Jordan needed them most. And it wasn't just Larissa and Christopher. An entire system, those tasked with protecting him, would also find themselves trapped under the weight of their own silent verdict. One social worker who once handled the Rodriguez family's case broke down during a post-trial interview. Her voice cracked as she admitted, "We failed to protect Jordan. We saw the signs, we heard the warnings, but we didn't act fast enough, strong enough." She bowed her head, tears splashing onto the notes trembling in her hands, a confession no court demanded, but one her conscience forced her to make day after day, night after night. Jordan's story wasn't just the tragedy of one broken home. It was a mirror held up to a fractured society, overburdened in different systems. Communities that learned to turn away from suffering either from fear or from sheer exhaustion. Individuals who had the chance to save a fragile life but let it slip through their fingers into the dark. Larissa and Christopher will serve time. But the true sentence they must endure, the one not measured in years, is to live with the name Jordan Rodriguez, whispering in their minds every night, reminding them of the boy they abandoned, the boy. They hurt the boy. They silenced forever. And Jordan, a boy who had never once heard the sound of the world, now echoes louder than ever, his silent cry piercing the hearts of all those still capable of feeling grief. A small grave tucked away in a forgotten corner of a sprawling cemetery, buried under a heavy blanket of pure white snow. No flowers, no visitors, only a simple wooden marker, cold and weathered, bearing a single name, Jordan Rodriguez. The wind swirls tiny flurries across the grave as if trying to erase even the memory of the small boy the world had forgotten. Above the sky hangs heavy and gray, weighted down with all the sorrow this story leaves behind. The narrator's voice rises low and broken. Sometimes cruel indifference is more terrifying than death itself, and little angels like Jordan paid for it with their lives. The image of the small grave slowly fades into the endless white of the snowstorm, leaving behind a heavy silence, one that lingers long after the final frame fades to black. Sometimes cruel indifference is more terrifying than death itself, and little angels like Jordan paid for it with their lives.